September 1941. The prison train, comprised of windowless cattle cars packed with the condemned, lurched eastward across the vast expanse of the USSR. Janusz Bardach, a 21-year-old Polish soldier, now just a prisoner with an unknown number, pressed his body against the rough, splintered wood as the relentless rhythm of Soviet rails carried him toward what he believed was certain death. His official crime was a vague charge of anti-Soviet activities, a label applied to millions. His sentence had been death by firing squad, a fate he had steeled himself for, only to have it commuted at the very last moment to 10 years of hard labor in the dreaded Kolyma region. The NKVD guards who had violently shoved him aboard the train had laughed at the news. 10 years in Kolyma, one of them sneered, "It is the same as a bullet, just much, much slower." The month-long journey was a descent into a primal state, stripping away every layer of his former self until only a raw survival instinct remained. 80 men were crammed into a space designed for half that number, or perhaps only for cattle. A crude hole sawed into the floorboards served as the latrine, its foul miasma a constant, inescapable presence. Bread, their only sustenance, was passed through a small slot twice a day, 400 grams if the guards remembered or cared, often less. Water arrived irregularly in rusty, scum-lined buckets, prompting desperate struggles. In the suffocating press of humanity, men died standing up, their corpses held upright by the sheer density of bodies until the next lurch of the train sent them slumping to the filth-covered floor. The initial stench of sweat, fear, and excrement became normal. The periodic screams of madness or pain eventually faded into a collective, exhausted silence. Bardach, observant and quiet, learned the brutal hierarchy of the car with grim speed. The Times Urki asterisk, hardened professional criminals, were the undisputed masters of this mobile microcosm. They took whatever they wanted, food, warmer clothes, even lives with impunity. Bardach witnessed a professor from Leningrad, a man who still clung to a shred of dignity, try to keep his threadbare wool coat. The Times Urki Times beat him unconscious, stripped him of the coat, and nonchalantly shoved his limp body through the waste hole while the train rattled onward. The politicals, the 58ers like Bardach, who were charged under the infamous Article 58 as enemies of the people, learned to make themselves small and quiet. Invisibility was the only viable form of survival. At Vladivostok, the journey's next chapter began. Guards, brutal and impatient, herded them from the stinking cars onto a windswept dock. The SS Jurma waited, a rusted, decrepit hulk that seemed to reek of death and despair even before they boarded. 4,000 times Zex asterisk, or prisoners, were packed into holds designed for inanimate cargo. Bardach clambered down a rickety iron ladder into a cavern of absolute darkness. He felt bodies pressing against him from all sides. Then, with a deafening clang that echoed like a pronouncement of doom, the massive hatch slammed shut. For the next 2 weeks, this iron tomb would carry them north, across the unforgiving sea of Okhotsk to Magadan, the gateway to Kolyma. The hold was a vision of hell frozen over. There was no light, no ventilation, just the thick, recycled air of 4,000 suffering men. Bodies were packed so tight that to fall meant certain death by trampling. The Times Blatnoy asterisk, the elite career criminals who ruled the Gulag underworld, had claimed the upper tiers of bunks near the hatch where what little breathable air existed could be found. From their vantage point, they looked down upon the politicals below like malevolent gods watching insects drown in their own filth. Bardach managed to wedge himself against a cold, sweating bulkhead, pulling his knees tight to his chest to conserve space and warmth. Around him, the chorus of misery swelled. Men vomited from the violent seasickness as the ship pitched and rolled in the heavy Arctic swells. The foul mixture of human waste and seawater sloshed across the iron floor in the darkness. Every 12 hours, a sliver of light appeared, as the guards briefly opened the hatch. Buckets of a thin, watery soup were lowered on ropes. The Times Blacknoy Times took their fill first, snatching the buckets and ladling out generous portions for themselves. What little remained was then lowered into the squirming mass below. Bardak learned to fight for a position, to claw his way through the desperate scrum to get a cup of brackish liquid that might have once seen a fish. He drank it greedily. Beside him, a man collapsed, his life extinguished by typhus or starvation, or perhaps simply by the utter surrender of his will to live. The body stayed where it fell, gradually becoming just another obstacle in the dark. There was nowhere to move it. In the endless night, the Times Blacknoy Times ran card games, using pieces of bread as currency, their laughter sharp and cruel. They sang their prison songs, haunting, cruel ballads about informers, famous camps, and the many faces of death. One night, their predatory gaze fell upon a young Ukrainian intellectual, deeming him too soft for this world. Their assault was brutal and prolonged. His screams echoed in the iron chamber for hours, a sound that etched itself into Bardak's soul. No guards came. The guards never came down into the hold. On the 10th day, the cold intensified dramatically. They were entering the northern waters, and the chill seeped through the ship's steel plates. Despite the press of bodies, men began to freeze. Bardak felt the warmth leaching from his own feet, a terrifying numbness creeping up his legs. He forced himself to move, constantly flexing his toes, wiggling his fingers, doing anything to keep his blood circulating. He focused on the simple act of creating friction, of staying alive through sheer will and minuscule movement. A schoolteacher from Kiev, who had been muttering Pushkin to himself, stopped moving. His eyes remained open, staring into a darkness only he could see. Without hesitation, Bardak stripped the dead man of his thin shirt, adding a pathetic but vital layer against the encroaching ice. The SS Zerma finally docked at Nagaev Bay, Magadan, on a morning so ferociously cold that each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Guards threw open the hatches, their shouts echoing down into the hold. "Climb out! Form columns! Move, you scum!" Bardak's legs, atrophied from disuse, barely functioned. He hauled his emaciated body up the ladder, rung by painful rung, emerging into a bleak, grey world. The sunlight, even though weak, hit him like a physical blow after 2 weeks of total blackness. The dock was a desolate expanse of ice and frozen gravel. In the distance, the mountains of Kolyma rose, their peaks white and utterly pitiless. Bodies of the dead from the hold littered the deck, dragged up and tossed aside like sacks of refuse. Bardak subconsciously counted 40 before he forced himself to stop. Guards with rifles and snarling dogs pushed the stumbling survivors into columns. An NKVD officer in a crisp uniform stood watching, his face a mask of bored indifference. This was routine. Ships laden with half-dead cargo for the gold mines arrived weekly. Magadan, the administrative center of the Kolyma camps, was a city built on foundations of suffering. Wooden buildings lined frozen, rutted streets. Smoke rose from chimneys, a deceptive sign of warmth and life. It looked almost normal until Bardak saw the other prisoners. They walked like specters, skeletal figures draped in padded jackets that hung loose on their wasted frames. Their eyes were vacant, seeing nothing. These were the Times Dokodiagi asterisk, the goners, men so far gone down the path of starvation and exhaustion that they were already dead, though their bodies hadn't yet received the message. The columns marched through the ghost city to the transit camp, officially Kolyma Transit Point, but known to all as Hell's Waiting Room. Barbed wire fences enclosed rows of long wooden barracks with guard towers at each corner. The gates creaked open, the columns shuffled inside, and the gates slammed shut behind them. A guard began reading names from a list. Bardak heard his. Barrack 7. Gold Mining Brigade. Report tomorrow at dawn. The barrack was a long, low structure, with three-tier wooden bunks lining both walls. A single stove sat cold and useless in the center. 200 men were being assigned to a space meant for 80. Bardach spotted an unclaimed section of bare boards on a top bunk and scrambled to claim it. His worldly possessions consisted of the clothes he wore, including the shirt stolen from a dead man on the ship. His food would be whatever they gave him tomorrow. His future was a terrifyingly simple calculation, measured in days or weeks before his body would inevitably quit. A prisoner with haunted grey eyes and deeply hollowed cheeks climbed up beside him. "First time in Kolyma?" he asked, his accent clearly Georgian. His hands were wrapped in filthy rags. Bardach nodded, his throat too dry to speak. "The gold mine is better than the lumber camp, but worse than road building," the man stated, as if discussing weather. "You'll get 500 grams of bread if you meet the quota. 300 if you don't. Nobody ever meets the quota." The Georgian held up his wrapped hands. The rags were stained with dark, dried blood. Frostbite. "I lost 3 fingers last winter. You will lose parts of yourself here. The only question is how much you lose before you die. Most new arrivals don't see 6. The Georgian's eyes held no hope, no fear, only the stark presentation of facts. The administration doesn't care if you live or die. The quota is all that matters. Gold for the state. Your life means nothing. That night, lying on the hard, unforgiving boards, Bardach understood his situation with a perfect, terrifying clarity. Kolyma was not a prison. It was an extermination machine that happened to extract gold as a byproduct of its killing. The yearly death rate exceeded 50%. Simple mathematics dictated that everyone died eventually. The cold killed, the work killed, the starvation killed, the guards killed, the criminals killed, the diseases killed. Survival here was not about living, it was about delaying death, day by frantic day, meal by meager meal, breath by frozen breath. But as he lay there in the fetid darkness, listening to the symphony of coughing, moaning, and quiet weeping that filled the barrack, Bardach felt something alien stir within him, something the system was not designed to accommodate. It wasn't resignation, it wasn't despair, it was anger. A cold, lucid, and utterly focused anger. He was 21 years old. He had survived the Wehrmacht's invasion of Poland. He had survived months of Soviet interrogation. He had survived a death sentence, a month in a cattle car, and 2 weeks in the hold of a hell ship. He would be damned if he let this frozen wasteland be his final entry. The system wanted him to become human dust, a number that dug until it fell and was buried in the permafrost. But Janusz Bardach was still a soldier. He was still Polish, and he still possessed the one thing the Gulag could not ration, confiscate, or destroy: his mind. Somewhere in this monolithic machine of death there had to be a weakness, a crack in the mechanism, a way to slip through the bars and vanish into the vast hostile wilderness. The Georgian was wrong about one thing. The question wasn't how much Bardach would lose before he died. The question was how much he was willing to risk to live. In September 1941, as the first winds of the long winter began to blow down from the Arctic, Janusz Bardach made a decision. He would not die here. He would not become an anonymous number in a mass grave. He would escape. He just needed to find out how. Dawn came brutally early, announced by guards hammering on the barrack walls with clubs. Roll call in the yard. Bardach joined the column of shivering prisoners shuffling outside. The temperature had plummeted below freezing overnight. His breath came in thick white clouds. The guards were bundled in heavy coats and fur hats. The prisoners wore whatever rags they owned. An NKVD officer on a platform mechanically read out work assignments, names, numbers, brigades, quotas. Gold mine workers to the trucks. Lumber camp to the forest. Road builders to the coastal route. Each assignment was a different flavor of death sentence. distinguished only by its speed. Bardak's brigade was loaded onto the open back of a flatbed truck. 30 prisoners, 2 guards with rifles, and a driver who looked profoundly bored. The truck rumbled out of the transit camp and headed northeast, toward the mountains, toward the mines, toward whatever specific hell awaited them. But as the truck bounced over the frozen, rutted roads and Bardak stared out at the passing landscape of stunted larch trees and endless snow, he was no longer just a victim. He was a strategist. He studied everything with a soldier's eye. The route, the exact positions of the guards, the distance between checkpoints, the driver's routine, his tired movements, the way the guards' vigilance relaxed once they were away from the main camp. He absorbed the small details, the tiny cracks in the edifice of control, because in Kolyma, the most feared corner of the Gulag, where men died like flies and hope was a luxury no one could afford, Janusz Bardak had just started planning something impossible. He was going to steal a truck, drive away, and disappear. The guards would be stunned when it happened. They would never see it coming from a Times Dokodiaga asterisk, because dead men don't steal trucks. And everyone in Kolyma was already dead. They just didn't all know it yet. Chapter 2. The infirmary assignment came after Bardak collapsed face first onto frozen rock at the mine face. A guard assumed him dead until another prisoner's kick to his ribs got a groan. They dragged him to the medical barracks, a drafty structure where men recovered marginally or died out of sight. The feldsher, a veterinarian named Collier, examined Bardak's emaciated frame. Scurvy, severe malnutrition, frostbite. 10 days at the mine face, Collier said flatly. Here, maybe 30 if you're useful. He assigned Bardak to indoor cleaning duties, away from the killing cold. The infirmary routine began at 0500. Bardak emptied bedpans, scrubbed blood and excrement from the floors, and hauled bodies to the morgue shed. The work was degrading but warm. The barracks had a wood stove, fed by scavenged scraps. For the first time in months, Bardak could feel his fingers. His scurvy-ridden gums bled less. Collier supplemented his rations with potato peelings from the staff kitchen, nutrients that added 5 pounds to his skeletal frame in 3 weeks. During his second week, morning roll call was held outside the medical barracks. Bardak stood with 40 other patients, watching the main camp's roll call across the compound. 5,000 men in ragged uniforms stood in columns as guards counted them in the pre-dawn darkness. The temperature was -47. Bardak saw a man in the third row sway and topple forward like a felled tree. When the numbers matched the log, the columns marched to the mine, stepping over the frozen body without acknowledgement. The corpse would remain until the spring thaw. Bardak had seen it before, but now, with the fog of malnutrition clearing from his mind, he saw the mechanical precision. The guards weren't sadistic. They were administrators of an efficient death system. Work details operated like clockwork. At 0600, prisoners marched to the Kolyma goldfields. The mine's official 8-hour shifts became 14, with mandatory volunteer overtime. Men chipped permafrost with pickaxes and shovels. Rations were tied to output quotas. 600 grams of bread for meeting the quota, 400 grams for falling short. The mathematics guaranteed death. The caloric expenditure of 14 hours of labor in sub-zero temperatures far exceeded what even full rations provided. The system consumed men like fuel, burning through them to extract gold for the Soviet state. Bardak's infirmary assignment gave him an observer's perspective. He began noticing patterns. Guard shifts changed at 0600, 1,400 and 2,200, creating a 15-minute window of laxity during changeover. The vehicle depot received supply trucks every Tuesday and Friday from Magadan, 800 kilometers southeast. They carried food, medical supplies, equipment, and explosives. The Free Soviet drivers often lingered at the camp canteen, drinking and warming themselves before the return journey. A patient named Popov, a former mining engineer arrested for bourgeois nationalism, provided crucial information. His leg was crushed in a tunnel collapse, and he was left to die slowly in the infirmary. Popov talked constantly, his fever dreams mixing with lucid technical knowledge. The GAZAA trucks, he muttered one night as Bardach changed his bandages, worthless in this cold. You drain the oil every night or the engine seizes. Every morning, heat the oil over a fire, pour it back in, heat the block with blowtorches. Takes an hour to start. The old engineer's eyes focused. But once running, they'll go 400 kilometers before needing fuel, 45-liter tank. I maintained a whole fleet in Dnipropetrovsk. By his fourth week, Bardach's mind had cleared enough for thought beyond survival. He was 95 pounds but could walk without collapsing. His teeth were still loose, but he could chew the saltfish Collier procured. The mental fog of an animal scrambling for scraps had lifted. He began studying the camp's rhythms with the analytical precision he'd honed in medical school before the war. The guards followed predictable patterns. The day shift commander, Senior Sergeant Mikhailov, was a career NKVD man who ran the camp with brutal efficiency but stuck rigidly to regulations. He inspected the depot at 0730, the mine entrance at 1000, and took lunch from 1200 to 1300. His subordinates relaxed in his absence. Lieutenant Zuyev's evening shift was sloppier. He drank vodka in his office. The night shift was a skeleton crew, as the administration assumed the cold and exhaustion prevented escape attempts after dark. The infirmary's position gave Bardach access to information other prisoners lacked. Guards used the warm infirmary for paperwork, and Bardach, invisible as a janitor, overheard them. He learned the spring prisoner transport was scheduled for late April, once ice roads were passable. The commandant faced pressure from Moscow to increase gold production by 20%, and equipment breakdowns meant supply trucks, due twice weekly, sometimes came only once. Another patient, Grigory, a former truck driver, proved significant. He arrived with severe pneumonia but survived against the odds. As his fever broke, he talked obsessively about vehicles. The GAZA is simple, he whispered hoarsely to Bardach. 3-speed manual, 4-cylinder engine. Any idiot can drive it if they understand the clutch. The trick in winter is keeping momentum. Stop on an incline, you'll never get moving again. You need to keep it rolling. His eyes glazed with fever. I drove supply routes from Leningrad to Moscow, arrested for stealing tires I never stole. During his 6th week, something shifted inside Bardach. It happened while hauling a corpse to the morgue shed, a 20-year-old Ukrainian who had frozen to death indoors, his body finally giving out. Bardach and another patient, Kostya, carried him through the snow to the shed where bodies were stacked like cordwood. Laying the corpse among the others, Bardach looked at the boy's peaceful face and felt rage ignite where resignation had festered. The entire system, the guards, the quotas, the cold, the starvation, was an execution machine designed for maximum efficiency. And everyone, the guards, the prisoners, even Bardach himself had accepted it, sliding toward death with the passive numbness of the doomed. Standing in that morgue shed, surrounded by frozen bodies, Bardach's mind cleared with crystalline focus. He wasn't dead yet. He had regained enough strength to walk, think, and plan. He possessed medical training, engineering knowledge, and information other prisoners lacked. The truck schedules, the guard patterns, the vehicle depot's procedures. And now, thanks to Popov and Grigory, he understood the trucks, how to start them in sub-zero temperatures, their mechanics, and their range on a full tank of fuel. The idea formed not as wild hope, but as a tactical calculation. The vehicle depot sat 200 meters from the main gate, separated from the barracks by administrative buildings and guard quarters. Supply trucks from Magadan carried explosives, ammonium nitrate, dynamite, blasting caps. They parked overnight before unloading, vulnerable during the dark hours when the camp operated with minimal staff. A prisoner, in the right place at the right time, with the right knowledge and enough desperate courage, might reach a truck, might start the engine, might drive it through the gate before the guards could organize a response. The plan was borderline suicidal, the odds approaching zero. But zero wasn't the certainty of death that awaited him if he remained. He knew with absolute conviction that staying meant death within months once he returned to the mine face. The system was designed to kill him. Attempting escape might fail, probably would, but failure was no worse than the guarantee he already faced. It was not hope that changed him. Hope was a luxury for those with futures. It was the recognition that he could act. He had gathered intelligence, regained strength, and identified a vulnerability. Death was assured either way. The question was whether he would die passive and broken or die fighting, refusing to submit to an execution machine disguised as a labor camp. The observation that crystallized everything came on a Friday in March. A Gaz AA explosives truck arrived late, at 1,700 hours, its driver complaining of mechanical issues. Guards directed him to park near the depot and report to the commandant's office. Bardach, carrying medical waste to the incinerator, watched the driver walk away from the idling truck. He left it running to avoid the hour-long process of restarting it. The truck sat there, engine rumbling, loaded with explosives, and completely unguarded for nearly 10 minutes before a sentry wandered over. 10 minutes, an eternity. A window of possibility that would open again. Beside the incinerator, feeding bloody bandages into flames, Bardach knew he was going to steal a truck. Not someday, but soon. Deliberately. The infirmary had granted him a temporary reprieve to regain strength and gather intelligence, but it was time-limited. Collier would eventually discharge him back to the fatal labor of the mine face. He had weeks, maybe only 2, to finalize a plan and wait for the right moment. He needed an explosives truck left vulnerable, distracted guards, and a window of possibility opened just wide enough for a desperate man to drive through. His destination was freedom or death, either preferable to the grinding certainty of execution by forced labor in the frozen hell of Kolyma. Chapter 3. The Studebaker's engine idled, a mechanical purr that suddenly represented something impossible freedom. Janusz Bardach stood beside the truck loaded with 3 tons of ammonal explosives, watching the guard's shack where 3 NKVD men lay in alcoholic oblivion. Semyon's whispered words hung in the frozen November air like a challenge to the entire Soviet system. This is it. We take the truck. We drive. Bardach's heart hammered against his ribs. In the 18 months since his arrest in Petropavlovsk, he had survived typhus, starvation rations, and the brutal indoctrination of the Gulag system. He had forged a truck driver's license from a blank form stolen during a moment of chaos at the Magadan transit camp. He had taught himself to handle the massive Lend-Lease Studebaker through sheer desperation and mechanical intuition. Every day had been about enduring until tomorrow. The guards had been drinking since noon when they intercepted a geological survey team carrying 5 liters of pure spirit alcohol intended for equipment sterilization. By 3 o'clock, all 3 were unconscious in their heated guard shack, snoring off industrial-grade ethanol while the temperature outside dropped to -20 Celsius. The truck sat running standard procedure in Kolyma's brutal cold, where shut-off engines froze solid within minutes. The question burning through Bardach's mind was brutally simple. Would he die trying to escape, or die waiting for the system to kill him anyway? His hands were shaking, but not from cold. Adrenaline flooded his system, bringing a clarity he hadn't felt since his arrest. The numbness that allowed him to survive each day, the deliberate emotional shutdown necessary to endure the gulag cracked open. Underneath was rage. Pure, focused rage at every humiliation, every beating, every friend he'd watched die from overwork or disease. Semyon was already moving toward the truck's passenger side, his movements quick and decisive. The other prisoner was a former Red Army sergeant, arrested after Stalingrad for the crime of being captured by Germans and then escaping back to Soviet lines. The NKVD considered anyone who'd seen the West to be contaminated. Semyon had been in the camps for 8 months. His eyes held the same calculation Bardock was making. Death was coming either way, but at least this way they'd choose the manner. Bardock's medical training from university reasserted itself, analyzing his physical state clinically. Malnourished, but functional. The typhus had stripped 20 kilograms from his frame, but the truck driving detail meant better rations than general laborers received. His hands were steady enough to drive. His mind was clear. The desperation that might make him reckless was balanced by the strategic thinking that had kept him alive. He could do this. The probability of success was microscopic, but the probability of surviving another Kolyma winter in the camps was equally grim. The math was simple. Both paths led to probable death. Only one path led toward freedom first. The transformation happened in seconds. The camp that had been his prison became a tactical problem to solve. Bardock's eyes swept the compound with new purpose. The guard shack sat 30 meters from the truck. The main gate was another 100 meters past that, unmanned because the regular gate guards had joined the drinking. Standard procedure relied on multiple security layers. But this delivery detail operated outside normal camp boundaries. They were already beyond the wire, at a supply depot serving the gold mines. The nearest NKVD post was the checkpoint at kilometer marker 47 on the Kolyma highway, roughly 23 kilometers northeast. Behind them, back toward Magadan, another checkpoint sat at kilometer marker 12. Both directions meant running a gauntlet, but the Studebaker was American-made, built for durability and power. It could outrun the Soviet gas trucks the NKVD used for patrol. Maybe. Bardock's mind raced through the inventory of supplies on the truck. 3 tons of ammonal explosives in wooden crates, 2 spare tires, a toolbox with standard equipment, a 5-liter jerrycan of gasoline. The guards' rifles, 3 Mosin Nagant 91, 30 seconds were inside the shack with the unconscious men. Taking them meant entering the shack, risking the guards waking up. The trade-off calculation was immediate. Weapons increased survival odds if caught, but the delay and noise decreased the odds of getting away clean. Bardock decided. They would run unarmed. Speed was everything. Bardock said quietly to Semyon, his voice steady despite the trembling in his core. South toward Magadan first, then west into the mountains before the checkpoint. Semyon nodded. Both men understood the territory. The Kolyma highway was the only road. A thin line of gravel and frozen mud connecting the coastal city of Magadan to the inland gold mines. It ran through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, taiga forest, permafrost, river valleys where temperatures dropped to -60 in deep winter. The road itself was built by Gulag labor, constructed over the bones of thousands of prisoners who died during its construction. Bardock had driven it 17 times in the past month. He knew every curve, every treacherous ice patch, every kilometer marker. The escape route crystallized in his mind. South on the highway for approximately 15 kilometers, which would take them away from the nearer checkpoint at kilometer 47. Then west onto one of the mining access roads that branched into the mountains. The access roads were rough, barely maintained tracks to remote geological survey sites, but they led into wilderness where pursuit would be difficult. From there, Bardock forced himself not to think too far ahead. First, they had to get away from this depot, then survive the initial pursuit, then figure out how to cross 9,000 kilometers of Soviet territory to a border. He pulled himself up into the driver's seat, feeling the engine's familiar vibration through the steering wheel. The Studebaker US-6 was a beast of a machine, 6 wheels, all-wheel drive, designed to handle brutal terrain. The Americans had sent thousands to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, and they were prized for their reliability. This truck had Nevada license plates still attached, a strange ghost of its capitalist origins now serving Stalin's gold mining operation. Bardak's hands found the gear shift. He had practiced this sequence dozens of times, but never with his life depending on perfect execution. Semyon climbed into the passenger seat, breathing hard. The door closed with a solid thunk that seemed impossibly loud. For 3 seconds, neither man moved. This was the commitment point. Once he shifted into gear and drove toward that gate, they were dead men if caught. Torture first, show trial maybe, execution certainly. The NKVD reserved special hatred for escapees. They would be examples, lessons to other prisoners about the futility of resistance. Bardak thought of his family in Odessa, his mother, his sister. He had not seen them since his arrest. Letters were impossible. They probably thought him dead already. If he died escaping, at least he would die moving toward them, not rotting in a mine shaft. The image of his mother's face steadied him. "Go," Semyon said. One word. It was enough. Bardak released the brake and shifted into first gear. The Studebaker lurched forward, tires finding purchase on the frozen ground. The truck rolled through the gate and onto the Kolyma highway, turning south. The road stretched empty in both directions, a grey ribbon through white wilderness. Behind them, the guards remained unconscious. Bardak pressed the accelerator, feeling the truck respond. Second gear, third gear. The speedometer climbed past 40 kilometers per hour, fast enough to be committed, slow enough to maintain control on the icy surface. The November afternoon was already dimming toward the long Siberian darkness. In this latitude, sunset came by 4 o'clock in late autumn. Bardak checked the dashboard clock 1540 hours. They had perhaps 90 minutes of daylight left. After that, they would be driving with only the truck's headlights, visible for kilometers across the flat taiga. Every pursuing vehicle would see them. But darkness also meant the guards might not discover the theft for hours. Men drinking pure spirit alcohol did not wake quickly or coherently. Bardak calculated if the guards remained unconscious until nightfall, that gave them perhaps 3 hours head start. 3 hours to cover maximum distance, abandon the truck, and disappear into the wilderness. His mind was working with a speed and clarity he had thought lost to starvation and despair. Every detail mattered now. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, perhaps 200 kilometers of range. The access road to the Yagodny mining district branched west at kilometer marker 32, still 45 kilometers south of their current position. That was the turn. That was where they would leave the highway and disappear. Bardak's foot stayed steady on the accelerator. The truck rumbled south, carrying 2 escaped prisoners and enough explosives to level a city block. The absurdity was not lost on him. They were driving the Soviet state's own materiel toward freedom, powered by American engineering, fleeing a system calling itself the workers' paradise while working its people to death. Semyon was watching the road behind them in the side mirror, his jaw clenched. No dust cloud appeared, no pursuit vehicles materialized. The highway remained empty, just 2 tire tracks in the frozen mud and the vast, indifferent wilderness pressing in from all sides. Bardak had driven this road enough times to know its rhythm. The checkpoints operated on predictable schedules. The garrison at kilometer 47 changed shifts at 1800 hours. If they could reach the turnoff before then, before the shift change discovered them missing from the depot, they might actually make this work. The determination settled into his bones, replacing fear with purpose. He had been a victim for 18 months, prey to a system designed to break him. Now he was acting. The steering wheel was solid under his hands. The engine's growl was steady and powerful. Semyon sat beside him, another man choosing death in motion over death waiting patiently. They were human again, not Zeks, not numbers marked for extinction in the mines. The truck 8 kilometers. The tiger blurred past, and Janusz Bardak drove toward a future that probably included a bullet, but might just possibly include home. Chapter 4, November 1943, the Kolyma Highway. Janusz Bardak gripped the wheel of the Studebaker, his heart hammering against his ribs. He and Semyon had driven straight out of the penal colony, the sentries at the gate waving them through. They were free, armed with one of the most powerful weapons in the Gulag, a fully fueled American truck on the only major road for 1,000 miles. Their audacious plan was simple: drive west for thousands of kilometers to Yakutsk and disappear into the Soviet Union. For hours they barreled down the frozen highway, passing watchtowers and checkpoints. At each one, Bardak would flash his transport papers for the Amonal. Terrified of questioning a seemingly official explosives transport, the guards waved them through apathetically, sending the two escaped Zeks further on their impossible journey. The only sound was the hum of an engine, a promise of a life they thought was lost forever. The plan had formed 3 weeks earlier in the powder magazine, where Bardak and Semyon handled crates of Amonal for the gold mines. Bardak observed the weekly truck drivers, noticing how guards barely glanced at transport papers, how a palpable fear of the explosives kept everyone at a distance. The drivers stayed overnight in the guards' heated barracks, leaving their powerful Studebakers unguarded in the compound. One November night, a free worker from Yakutsk, drunk on vodka, had bragged about the run: 3,000 kilometers of frozen road, checkpoints every 100 kilometers, but nobody ever stopped an explosives transport. It was too dangerous, too much paperwork if something went wrong. That conversation planted the seed. The truck was the key, not tunnels through permafrost or a desperate run into the taiga that killed men in hours, but a vehicle with official papers and a cargo so feared that guards wouldn't risk inspection. Bardak approached Semyon during a smoke break behind the magazine, their breath fogging in air that burned the lungs. Semyon, a 43-year-old former accountant from Leningrad, arrested in 1938, was skeletal after 5 years in Kolyma. But his mind remained sharp. Bardak whispered the idea in Polish, gambling no one else understood. Semyon's eyes widened, then narrowed. He said nothing for 2 days. On the third day, while stacking crates, he nodded once. One ally. The risk was absolute. Trusting a man, after only 18 months working together, was a gamble on mutual desperation. An informer meant a bullet, but Semyon, having watched his own teeth fall out from scurvy and younger men die in the mines, had nothing left to lose but a death slightly delayed. Transport papers were the first necessity. Bardak worked near the magazine office, a plywood shack where the explosion supervisor, a lazy and often drunk free worker named Petrov, kept manifests. Over 2 weeks, Bardak observed Petrov's routine of arriving late and leaving early for the guards' barracks. The office lock was simple, a type Bardak had picked as a teenager in Łódź. He needed 10 minutes alone. The chance came when Petrov left early for a card game. While Semyon stood watch, Bardak slipped inside. Hands shaking, he rifled through papers, sweat freezing on his face in the unheated shack. Third drawer, blank transport forms for Amonal shipments. He took 2, folded them inside his jacket, and left everything as he found it. He was back outside in 7 minutes, his theft unnoticed. Filling out the forms required information Bardak gathered by carefully questioning the truck drivers. Destination codes, cargo classifications, signature styles. He practiced Petrov's signature on stolen scraps of latrine paper, burning each attempt in the barrel stove until, after a week, the forgery was perfect. The forms listed a shipment of Amonal from the Elgin penal colony to a mine complex near Yakutsk. Semyon, with his accountant's precision, checked every detail: date, cargo weight, vehicle number. A single error meant discovery at the first checkpoint. They filled out the papers by candlelight in the barracks after midnight. Bardak's hands steady, despite knowing these documents were either passage to freedom or death warrants. The close call came 11 days before the attempt. A guard sergeant entered the powder magazine for a routine inspection. Bardach had the forged papers hidden in his jacket. The sergeant walked past stacked crates, checking inventory numbers against his clipboard, then stopped near Bardach. He gestured at the ammonal and asked about the shipment schedule. Bardach's mouth went dry, the papers crinkling against his chest with each breath. Forcing his voice steady, he recited the official schedule he had memorized. The sergeant nodded, made a notation, and moved on. Bardach's hands trembled so violently he gripped a crate to steady them. Across the magazine, Semyon had gone pale. That night, Bardach reflected on how close they had come. The close call hardened their resolve. Hesitation now meant death in Kolyma. Preparation intensified. They hoarded and dried their bread rations, hiding enough for 3 days in their mattresses. Bardach stole a canteen, filling it daily, but emptying it before evening count to avoid discovery. Semyon acquired a crude knife from the kitchen, its purpose unspoken. Perhaps for defense, perhaps to end things quickly if capture was certain. From overheard conversations, they memorized driver routes and checkpoint locations. Yakutsk was 3,000 kilometers west. Between here and there lay frozen wilderness and NKVD patrols. But their hope lay in that single road, the official documents, and the universal carelessness inspired by a fear of explosives. They chose November 19th. A shipment was scheduled for the 20th, meaning a truck would arrive the evening before and stay overnight. The weather was critical. A blizzard would close the road. Clear skies meant more traffic. They needed it cold enough for guards to remain in their posts, but clear enough to drive. Bardach watched the sky obsessively. On the 18th, clouds rolled in, but by evening they passed, leaving bitter cold and stars sharp as glass. Perfect. Semyon confirmed the truck's arrival, a Studebaker US-6 delivered through Lend-Lease. The driver was bunked with the guards. The truck sat in the compound, keys in the ignition, fuel tank full, its cargo bay loaded with ammonal. Everything was aligned. The 19th of November stretched endlessly. Morning count, then the work shift, each minute crawling. Lunch was bread and watery soup Bardach forced down. During the afternoon shift, checking inventory, he was acutely aware these were his last hours in the penal colony. At evening count, he stood in formation, breath clouding as guards shouted names. He answered to his dismissed. Semyon caught his eye across the yard. Both men knew. Tonight. Bardach lay on his bunk before lights out, listening to prisoners cough and mutter. He thought of his family in Łódź and the life he'd lost a medical student before the NKVD took him in 1941. Now, at 24, he was 30 kilograms lighter, but still alive, still capable of this act. At 10 o'clock, the barracks lights cut out. Bardach waited 30 minutes for breathing to settle into sleep, then rose silently, pulling on his jacket and Valenki boots. Semyon appeared from the darkness. Neither spoke. They moved toward the door, stepping over sleeping bodies. Outside, the compound lay under brilliant stars in 40 below zero cold. 50 meters away, the truck was a dark shape against the darker sky. Guard towers loomed, searchlights sweeping in predictable patterns. They had timed it. 15 seconds of shadow between sweeps. Bardach watched the nearest light sweep past. He counted. He ran. Boots crunched on frozen ground, each step a gunshot in his mind. Semyon was right behind him. Reaching the truck, Bardach grabbed the door handle. The metal so cold it burned through his glove. He climbed into the driver's seat. Semyon into the passenger side. The cab smelled of diesel and tobacco. Keys hung in the ignition. This was the moment. Starting the engine meant commitment. Guards would hear. He'd have to be through the gate before anyone understood. Hesitation was capture. He turned the key. The Studebaker's engine roared to life, shattering the frozen silence. Bardach threw it into gear, released the clutch, and the truck lurched forward. Voices shouted from the guard barracks. A searchlight swung over, pinning them in a white glare. Bardak accelerated, foot pressed to the floor. A confused guard stepped from the gatehouse, rifle unslung but not aimed. Bardak grabbed the forged papers and thrust them through the window, shouting his rehearsed lines above the engine. Emergency run to Yakutsk, orders from Petrov, ammunition needed at the mine. The guard hesitated, his eyes darting from the papers to the explosive-laden truck, to Bardak in his Zek's jacket. 2 seconds. 3. The calculation was clear on his face. Question this, and take responsibility if it explodes. Or wave them through and avoid paperwork. He waved them through. Bardak drove onto the Kolyma highway, gravel frozen hard as concrete. Behind them, the penal colony receded into darkness. No alarm sounded. No shots were fired. Semyon exhaled. A shaking breath. Bardak's heart beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs. They were out. After years in the gulag, after watching men die, escape had taken nothing more than forged papers and a truck. The absurdity of it threatened hysteria. The highway stretched west. Bardak pushed the Studebaker to a risky 60 kilometers per hour, the truck bouncing over ruts as crates of ammonal shifted in the back. He pictured a crate rupturing, a spark, obliteration. But the alternative was Kolyma. He pressed harder. The first checkpoint appeared after 90 minutes, a barrier lowered across the road. Bardak's mouth went dry as he slowed to a stop. A guard emerged, his face wrapped against the cold. Bardak extended the transport papers, forcing his hand steady. The guard's flashlight beam moved from the documents to the cargo bay, then to Bardak and Semyon's prisoner jackets. Bardak held his breath, but the guard's expression showed only boredom and a desire to return to his heated post. Confronted with an explosives transport and official papers in the middle of the night, questioning them wasn't worth the risk. He handed back the papers, raised the barrier, and waved them on. Bardak drove on, legs trembling. Beside him, Semyon stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. 3,000 kilometers to Yakutsk. 20, maybe 30 more checkpoints. Each one a roll of the dice. The second and third checkpoints passed similarly, the guards barely glancing at the documents before waving them through. Bardak began to understand the power of their bluff. No one wanted the responsibility for an explosives transport. The Studebaker became their armor. By sunrise, they had covered 200 kilometers and passed 6 checkpoints, each guard more apathetic than the last. For the first time in years, the sound filling Bardak's ears wasn't a guard's shout or the clang of mine equipment, but the steady hum of the Studebaker's engine, a mechanical promise that with each kilometer, the gulag fell further behind. The highway unwound before them through endless taiga, frozen and white beneath the pale morning sun. Semyon finally spoke, his voice rough from hours of silence. "We might actually make it." Bardak said nothing, hands gripping the wheel, eyes on the road, every sense alert for the next checkpoint, the next moment when their forged papers and stolen truck would either carry them to freedom or deliver them to a firing squad. Chapter 5. The wilderness swallows them whole. Bardak and Semyon pushed through thigh-deep snow, each step a battle against the taiga's white resistance. 3 kilometers behind them, the abandoned Studebaker was useless metal frozen against a birch grove. They carried only what they had grabbed from the cab: 2 blankets, a half-loaf of black bread, already frozen solid, matches wrapped in canvas, and 2 knives from the guard barracks. With the temperature at minus 30 Celsius and dropping, the cold air felt like inhaling glass, burning Bardak's lungs. His feet, numb for an hour, moved like pistons belonging to another man, barely responding to his brain's commands. Semyon, older but more resilient, forged ahead, his prison-hardened body adapted to Siberian extremes. The forest around them stood silent and indifferent, no bird song, no animal tracks. In this November void, only trees and desperate men existed. They trudged southwest, guided by the estimated position of a sun hidden behind perpetual grey clouds. Southwest meant away from Kolyma, away from the camps, toward what neither could say with certainty. Yakutsk and the Trans-Siberian Railway were hundreds of kilometers distant, theoretical concepts in this frozen chasm of reality. Bardak's body forced them to stop every 20 minutes. During these pauses, they wasted no energy on speech. Semyon would check their crude direction while Bardak focused on breathing, willing warmth back into his extremities. As dusk settled, snow began falling again, large flakes that were not beautiful, but a death sentence. It would cover their tracks, but slow them to a crawl, accelerating the hypothermia already creeping through their cores. A former doctor, Bardak knew the grim mathematics of cold, how the human body loses heat 25 times faster in wet conditions, how inadequate their clothing was. Without shelter and fire, he calculated they had perhaps 12 hours before their core temperatures dropped below survivable levels. His mind knew this intellectually. His body knew it viscerally. The shivering had started an hour ago and would not stop. Then Semyon froze, his hand raised in warning. Bardak stopped mid-step, breath catching in his throat. After 10 seconds of silence, he heard it too. The distant drone of an aircraft engine, flying low. Searching, they scrambled for cover beneath a dense cluster of snow-laden pines. Bardak pressed himself to the frozen ground, pulling a grey blanket over his body, hoping to blend with the white expanse. The drone grew into the roar of an Antonov AN-2 biplane, an NKVD reconnaissance craft designed for slow, detailed observation. Through the branches, Bardak watched it bank and circle, his heart hammering against the earth. Asterisk, don't move. Don't breathe visible vapor. Don't exist. Asterisk. The plane circled directly overhead, slowing until it nearly hovered, as the pilot masterfully held it against the wind. Bardak's mind raced with possibilities, visible tracks, body heat melting the snow, the disturbance from their scramble for cover. He could see the observer in the rear cockpit scanning the forest with binoculars. An eternity of 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Bardak's lungs screamed for air, but he took only tiny, controlled sips through his nose, the cold numbing his face. Finally, the observer lowered his binoculars and said something to the pilot. The engine note changed, and the aircraft banked west, continuing its search pattern. The sound faded, swallowed by the distance and the snowfall. They remained motionless for 2 more minutes. When Semyon finally rose, brushing away snow, his face was a stoic mask, but his eyes held a grim certainty. The NKVD wasn't guessing their direction. They were conducting a systematic search. The net was tightening. The encounter had changed everything. The taiga no longer felt empty, but watched. While the fugitives pushed deeper into the wilderness, the command center at Camp Sevostlag erupted in controlled fury. Major Ruslan Volkov of the NKVD's 3rd Directorate stood before a wall map of Kolyma, his jaw so tight the muscles jumped. For 7 days since 2 prisoners vanished in a truck loaded with explosives, humiliation had radiated from Moscow, with personal inquiries from Beria himself. The political machinery that devoured careers for lesser failures was in full motion. Volkov stabbed a finger at the map where aerial reconnaissance had located the abandoned Studebaker that morning. Tracks led southwest. Deploy everything to grid sectors 7 through 12. His voice cut like a blade through the room of assembled officers and civilian hunters. Aircraft sweep at first light. Snowmobile teams will establish checkpoints on every navigable corridor, and the civilians will track with dogs from the truck's position. The chief hunter, a weathered Yakut named Dmitri, who had tracked men through these forests for 15 years, shifted his weight. Major, the snow is heavy. Tracks will be impossible to follow by morning. If these men have any sense, they will move through deep taiga where snowmobiles can't pursue. Volkov's gaze was pure bureaucratic menace. Then you and your dogs will pursue on skis. I don't care if you track them on your hands and knees. These men humiliated the Soviet state. They stole military explosives. They are enemies of the people who must be recaptured or killed. There is no third option. There is no acceptable failure. The room absorbed the threat. The Gulag system functioned because escape was deemed impossible. These two men, 8 days free, represented a crack in that certainty. An MVD liaison spoke up. We have alerts at every settlement within 600 kilometers. Train stations, river crossings, supply depots. If they approach a populated area, we will know. Volkov nodded curtly. Assume they are moving toward Yakutsk or attempting to reach the Trans-Siberian Railway. Deploy observation posts at all bridge points and known fording locations. Civilians attempting to cross should be interrogated regardless of papers. Shoot anyone who runs. The machinery of pursuit roared to life as officers issued orders. 3 Mi-1 helicopters were being fueled. Pilots briefed for extended operations. 40 elite NKVD troops prepared winter gear for ground deployment. 10 snowmobiles with armed riders readied to sweep the forests. The best tracking dogs were being prepared. Volkov stared at the map again. The fugitives had an 8-day head start, but they were on foot, poorly equipped for weather that killed even prepared travelers within hours. The tiger itself was his greatest ally. Most escapees simply froze to death, their bodies recovered in the spring. Yet this escape troubled Volkov. The careful planning, the forged papers, the sheer audacity of driving a military truck through NKVD territory, these were not ordinary prisoners. They were thinking, adapting. That made them dangerous. Double the reward for information leading to capture, Volkov said quietly to an aide. 30,000 rubles. Spread the word to every native settlement, every hunting camp, every remote outpost. Someone will see them. Someone will talk. The meeting ended. By dawn, the largest manhunt in Kolyma region's history would be fully deployed, a mechanized, ruthless pursuit across the wilderness. Bardakh and Semyon knew nothing of the helicopters or the 30,000 ruble reward. They knew only the forest, the cold, and the desperate mathematics of survival. As darkness made travel impossible, Semyon found a small ravine where windfall trees had created a natural debris shelter. They cleared snow, creating a space barely large enough for both men to huddle. With hands shaking from cold and exhaustion, Bardakh wasted 3 matches before Semyon's steadier grip coaxed a fist-sized flame from the birch bark and dry needles they had gathered. It was more psychological comfort than actual warmth, but it was life. They melted snow in a metal cup and thawed their frozen bread over the tiny fire, gnawing on the softened crust. Semyon carefully portioned the bread, enough for perhaps 2 days of inadequate calories. Neither man spoke of what came after, as Bardakh leaned against the frozen earth. The depth of his exhaustion manifested as cramping muscles and the throbbing pain of returning circulation in his feet. Semyon sat cross-legged, staring into the embers. "We have 3 days," he said, his voice low. "Maybe 4 if the weather stays bad enough to keep the aircraft grounded. After that, our tracks, the fire smoke. Someone will find us." Bardakh knew even 3 days was a miracle. "Southwest to what?" he asked, voicing the question he had been avoiding. Semyon was quiet for a long moment. "The Olden River. 150 kilometers. If we don't get lost, there are settlements. Barges moving supplies. If we can reach it, if we can steal transport, we follow it to the Lena. From the Lena, the world opens. Asterisk. If. Asterisk." The word carried impossible weight. 150 kilometers through the taiga in November, with no supplies and the NKVD hunting them. The odds were astronomical, but the alternative, turning back, surrendering, was a guaranteed bullet or noose. Death ahead was uncertain. Death behind was not. The choice was no choice at all. As the fire died to embers, they huddled together for warmth under both blankets. a fragile pocket of shared heat against the wind that howled with an almost mocking voice. Sleep came in brief, agonized intervals. Bardach dreamed of warmth his mother's kitchen in Łódź before the war, of bread fresh from the oven only to wake to the same frozen darkness, the same desperate reality. Then a new sound returned in the night, the drone of aircraft engines, distant but unmistakable. The NKVD were hunting in darkness now. Bardach lay still under the blanket, watching distant searchlights sweep across the sky like mechanical stars. The lights passed a kilometer north, then returned, crisscrossing in a methodical, relentless pattern. The hunt had escalated. When the lights finally faded eastward, the silence offered no comfort. Both men knew the morning would bring more, many more. The net was closing. The tiger offered no mercy, and the NKVD offered no quarter. And for Janusz Bardach and Semyon, two escaped prisoners huddled in a ravine hundreds of kilometers from safety, the final confrontation between human will and overwhelming force was drawing inevitably closer. Chapter 6. The village appears through morning fog like a mirage Bardach no longer trusts. Wooden structures, izbas, dark against the snow. The scent of burning wood and cooked food, perhaps kasha or soup, hits his nostrils, and his stomach convulses violently, a knot of pure, agonizing emptiness. Beside him, Semyon staggers, his feet wrapped in rotting cloth that leaves dark, rust-colored stains in the pristine snow. Neither man speaks. Speech requires energy they don't possess. Every calorie is hoarded for the next step. They stumble forward because stopping means freezing to death where they stand, becoming another pair of stiff, forgotten statues in the endless white. The wilderness has consumed everything, their strength, their hope, their very identities, except the primal animal drive to move toward warmth. 3 weeks since they stole the explosives truck. 3 weeks of delirious running, hiding from patrols they only imagined, surviving on scraps and the raw flesh of a snared rabbit that had made them both sick for days. Bardach's frostbitten feet are black, numb lumps inside his disintegrating boots. His hands are swollen, useless clubs. His face is a mask of ice and caked dirt. They are walking corpses, and they know that everyone who sees them will know exactly what they are. The first person to spot them is a woman carrying 2 heavy wooden buckets from a well near the edge of the settlement. She freezes mid-step, her breath a static puff of white in the frigid air. The buckets slip from her numb fingers, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Her mouth opens, a dark O in her pale face, but no scream comes. Sound itself seems frozen. She turns and runs, slipping once on the new ice, scrambling back to her feet and fleeing toward the largest building in the small settlement, the one that likely serves as the local Soviet. Bardach and Semyon keep walking. There is nowhere else to go. The tiger behind them is a slow, cold death sentence. This village is a different kind of death sentence, a faster one, but at least it offers the possibility of dying warm. They reach the first building, and Bardach leans his full weight against the rough-hewn wall. The wood feels solid, real. He slides down its length and sits heavily in the snow. Semyon collapses beside him without a sound. They sit there, 2 skeletal figures in rags, waiting for whatever comes next. What comes next is a man in a heavy sheepskin coat and a formal fur hat, the kind that marks a person of minor authority, a local official, a party member, probably. He approaches carefully, his steps measured, as if they might be dangerous animals poised to spring. But up close, he can see they are not dangerous. They are barely alive. His eyes, small and weary, move over their skeletal faces, their tattered clothes, the sickly black of frostbite visible on their exposed skin. He knows. Every official in the Soviet Far East knows what escaped prisoners, Zeks, look like. The settlements are too small, too isolated. Strangers this far north are always either assigned here by the state or running from it. These two are clearly running, or were running. For them, the race is over. For a fleeting moment, a spark of pity flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold calculus of self-preservation. The official speaks, his voice sounding distant and distorted to Bardach, filtered through layers of exhaustion and profound hypothermia. Where did you come from? Which camp? How long have you been out? The questions are perfunctory, a script he has rehearsed in his mind 100 times. Bardach doesn't answer. He can't. His jaw is a block of ice and pain. Everything hurts. The official waits a moment, then turns and walks toward the main building. He returns with 2 steaming mugs of weak tea and a half loaf of dark bread. He sets them down on the snow within reach, but not too close. He's not a cruel man, but he's not a stupid one either. Helping escaped prisoners is a crime against the state. He'll feed them just enough to keep them from dying on his doorstep before the proper authorities arrive. That's all the mercy the system allows. Bardach reaches for the bread with his club-like hands, fingers refusing to grip. He drops it twice in the snow. On the 3rd try, he pins it with his palm and manages to get it to his mouth. The first bite of the coarse, sour bread makes him gag. His stomach, shrunken and dormant, has forgotten what food is. He forces it down, chewing mechanically. He sips the tea. An unfamiliar warmth spreads through his chest, a sensation so alien it is painful, and he realizes with a sickening lurch just how close to death he actually is. The warmth hurts. Coming back from the edge of freezing hurts worse than the cold itself. His body doesn't know whether to shut down or fight. He drinks more tea. He forces down more bread. Beside him, Semyon does the same, his movements slow and agonized. Neither man speaks. What is there to say? They made it further than anyone thought possible. They survived the November Tiger. They reached a settlement, and now it's over. The NKVD guards arrived the next morning. These are not camp guards. Not the underfed, alcohol-soaked thugs whose incompetence let 2 prisoners steal a truck and disappear into the wilderness. These are professionals from the Regional Security Directorate in Yakutsk. Their uniforms are clean, their faces are sober, and their eyes are devoid of emotion. Their jackboots are polished, their weapons clean, a striking contrast to the slovenly, half-frozen rabble that manned the camp watchtowers. They arrive in a proper vehicle, a gas truck with heavy chains on the tires, 4 of them. They look at Bardach and Semyon the way a farmer looks at diseased animals that need to be put down. The beating begins immediately. The first guard kicks Bardach hard in the ribs before he can even attempt to stand. The second blow, a fist, catches his jaw. Something cracks with a sickening crunch. A hot, metallic taste floods his mouth. Blood and broken teeth. He falls sideways into the snow, the pristine white instantly turning crimson. A boot finds his kidneys. Another his back. They don't speak. They don't ask questions. This isn't an interrogation. This is punishment. This is what happens to Zeks who dare to run. They work methodically, professionally, inflicting maximum pain without killing. They need Bardach alive for the return to camp. Dead prisoners cannot be made examples of. Bardach curls into a fetal position, his useless hands attempting to shield his head. The blows keep coming, rhythmic and brutal. His jaw is on fire. Each impact sends a nova of lightning through his skull. He can hear Semyon screaming nearby, a high, thin sound that is cut short by a wet thud. The villagers watch from the frost-rimmed windows of their huts. The local official who gave them tea watches from his doorway, his face a perfect, expressionless mask. This is Soviet justice. This is the price of escape. Everyone here understands the lesson. The beating continues until both prisoners are bloody, broken messes in the snow. Only then do the guards stop. They drag Bardach and Semyon to the truck and throw them in the back like sacks of spoiled grain. The drive back to camp takes 2 days. The metallic tang of blood was the only taste, the only reality. Bardak drifts in and out of a haze of pain-filled consciousness. His jaw is shattered. He can feel the jagged edges of the bone grinding against each other when the truck hits a bump in the frozen road. The pain is a living entity. It has consumed his entire world. He cannot eat. He can barely breathe. Blood pools in his mouth, thick and warm, and he has to keep turning his head to spit it out, to keep from drowning in it. Beside him, Semyon moans, a low, constant sound of pure suffering. They don't look at each other. They don't speak. There is nothing to say. The escape failed. Now comes the dying. The camp receives them like conquering heroes returned in utter disgrace. Word has spread. Everyone knows about the stolen explosives truck. Everyone knows they survived 3 weeks in the November Tiger, a feat bordering on the miraculous. And everyone knows they're about to die for it. The guards parade them through the center of the camp. Bardak can barely walk. 2 guards half carry, half drag him through the slush. Prisoners line the path, their faces a gallery of grim camp emotions. Eyes that held a dangerous glint of respect were quickly downcast as a guard passed. Others, those who had long ago surrendered, looked on with a vacant contempt for anyone foolish enough to still fight. Most show nothing at all. Emotion is a dangerous luxury. The guards throw Bardak and Semyon into the punishment cells, the Bur. Concrete boxes, 2 meters square. No heat, no light. Starvation rations of bread and water every 3 days. This is where escapees die slowly, as examples. Bardak lies on the frozen concrete floor. His jaw throbs in time with his frantic heartbeat. He can feel the heat of infection setting in. The break is bad, a compound fracture. He knows that without medical treatment, the infection will spread from the bone to the blood. Sepsis. Death. He knows this with a chilling certainty. He worked in the medical clinic before the escape. He understands exactly how he is going to die. Days pass in a blur of shivering and pain. He loses track of time. The cold is absolute, a physical presence that leeches the life from him. He cannot stop shivering, his body consuming itself for fuel. Muscle. Then, organs. The frostbite on his feet and hands is advancing. He can smell the sweet, nauseating rot of his own flesh. Gangrene. He's dying from multiple directions at once. He can almost trace the path of the infection from the splintered bone, up through the tissue of his cheek, a burning march toward his brain. The jaw will probably kill him first. On what he thinks is the 5th day, the cell door groans open. A rectangle of blinding light cuts through the darkness. A guard stands silhouetted against it. Behind him, another figure. The guard speaks. "Doctor wants to see you." Bardak tries to stand, to obey, but his legs won't respond. He collapses. The guard and the second man, the doctor, lift him. They carry him across the camp. Prisoners stare. The dead man walking. They take him to the medical clinic and place him on an examination table under a harsh, naked electric light. The doctor leans over him, studying his face with an unnerving intensity. The doctor's name is Kabardin. He is the camp doctor, a party member. He is also, miraculously, a human being, a rarity in the Gulag. Kabardin examines the jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle. He probes the break and Bardak screams, a muffled, horrifying sound through clenched, broken teeth. The doctor makes notes on a small pad. Speaking to himself in medical terminology, Bardak partially understands from his clinic days. Compound mandibular fracture, advanced infection signs, severe malnutrition, stage 3 frostbite. He looks at Bardak's eyes, really looks, past the filth and the agony. He sees something there. Not just desperation, but intelligence, resilience, something worth saving. He saw not just a prisoner, but a complex biological machine breaking down, a waste of a resilient human specimen. Kabardin makes a decision that defies Soviet logic. He will treat this prisoner. He will save this nearly dead escape artist. Not because the system demands it, the system demands he die as an example, but because something in him, the physician, rebels against the waste, against watching a man die when he can be saved. The treatment begins immediately. Kabardine cleans the deep wound. He sets the jaw. It is a primitive surgery, performed with inadequate tools and no anesthesia. Bardach passes out from the sheer, white-hot agony. He wakes to find his jaw wired shut. The doctor has improvised splints and administered a dose of precious sulfur drugs from his locked medical supplies. He has started him on a liquid nutrition of thin broth. Slowly, agonizingly, the infection begins to retreat. Bardach remains in the clinic. Kabardin keeps him there, ostensibly for extended observation. In reality, it is because returning him to the punishment cell means a certain slow death. The doctor has claimed this prisoner, making him a personal medical case study. The camp authorities, surprisingly, allow it. As far as they are concerned, Bardach is dying anyway. Let the doctor have his doomed experiment. Days become weeks. The jaw begins to heal. It will be crooked, but it is knitting back together. The infection clears. The frostbite claims 2 toes and the tips of 3 fingers, but against every probability, Bardach keeps his hands and his feet. He survives. Kabardin watches this recovery with a growing clinical interest. The prisoner's body is resilient, beyond normal parameters. But more than that, the prisoner himself is interested. As he regains strength, he asks questions, muffled through his wired jaw. He watches every procedure. He absorbs medical knowledge like a starving man absorbs food. He would point a swollen finger at a chart on the wall, his muffled question about the circulatory system barely intelligible, but his eyes were sharp and insistent. The doctor begins to teach. Nothing formal, just quiet explanations during treatments. Anatomy, pathology, basic surgical technique, Bardach learns. He has nothing else to do, and learning keeps his mind away from the horror of the failed escape and the brutal punishment. Months pass. Bardach moves from patient to assistant. He cleans the clinic. He helps with minor procedures, holding instruments during a surgery. Kabardin teaches him to change dressings, to recognize different types of infections, to administer medications. The camp authorities don't object. Every camp needs medical help, and trained doctors are a rarity. If Kabardin wants to train an escape artist as an assistant, so be it. The prisoner is still serving his sentence. He is still inside the wire. Bardach works 16-hour days in the clinic. It is brutal labor, but it is warm. It is medical work instead of pointless mining. It is, against all odds, survival. The escape failed. This is an undeniable fact. Bardach and Semyon did not reach freedom. They did not cross the border into Mongolia. The wilderness defeated them, and the NKVD broke them. Semyon died 2 weeks after their return, succumbing to a lung infection and a profound, bottomless despair. Bardach attended his death in the clinic, holding a cup of water to his friend's lips that he could not swallow. He watched his escape partner slip away, the last connection to that desperate, frantic flight into the taiga gone forever. In that moment, Bardach was truly alone, the shared dream of freedom now just his own grim memory. Bardach survived, but at a terrible cost. His jaw is permanently damaged. His hands and feet bear the livid scars of frostbite. He limps. He cannot fully close his mouth. The escape marked him physically in ways that will never heal. But something else happened in that punishment cell during that agonizing recovery, in those long months learning medicine from Kabardin. Bardach discovered that he wanted to live. Not just to survive, but to actually live. The escape attempt was an impulsive flight for freedom. The recovery became a disciplined fight for purpose. Medicine gave him that purpose. The broken jaw that should have killed him became the gateway to a future he never could have imagined. A Polish Jew in the heart of the Soviet Gulag, teaching himself medicine from a sympathetic doctor, surviving a punishment that killed nearly all who received it. The system tried to kill him for daring to escape. Instead, it accidentally gave him a profession. The war continues far outside the camp's wire fences. Soviet forces are pushing the Germans back. News filters in through new prisoner arrivals. The tide is turning. Bardach works in the clinic and learns. He saves lives when he can. He watches men die when he can't. The gulag grinds on. His sentence has years left to run. But he is no longer the naive young man who thought stealing a truck could lead to freedom. He is harder now. Scarred. The tiger taught him that nature is indifferent to human desperation. The NKVD taught him that the system does not forgive. And Kabardin, in a single act of defiance, taught him that individual humans, sometimes, still possess mercy. These lessons cost him everything. They also saved his life. He failed to escape the gulag, but he survived its worst punishment. The shattered jaw healed crooked and painful. It would ache for the rest of his life, a constant, dull throb that was a physical chronicle of his failure and his survival. Every time he opened his mouth to speak or eat, he would remember those brutal beatings in the Yakut village. Every time he treated a patient, he would remember Kabardin's careful hands setting his own broken bones. The escape and its aftermath became the central trauma of his camp years. But trauma, Bardach learned, doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it transforms. The man who stole an explosives truck died in that frozen punishment cell. The man who emerged became something the Soviet system never intended to create, a prisoner who found purpose in survival itself. Chapter 7. The Jaw Healed. In the decades following his liberation from Kolyma in 1945, Janusz Bardach carried two contradictions: the face he reconstructed for others and the one he saw in his own mirror, marked by the NKVD boot that shattered it years before. Though Soviet authorities kept him for another decade, they could not stop his transformation from prisoner to physician. Mentored by Dr. Katz, the camp doctor who saved him from the gold mines by keeping him in the medical unit, Bardach gained admission to medical school in Moscow. By the early 1952, Dr. Bardach was a specialist in plastic surgery, repairing in Soviet hospitals the same facial trauma NKVD interrogators inflicted. His patients never knew the skilled hands reconstructing their cheekbones belonged to a man whose own face bore permanent marks of state violence. During the 1956 post-Stalin thaw, Bardach emigrated, carrying his medical credentials and the unspoken story of the explosives truck, the frozen wilderness, and the camp that tried to erase him. After settling first in Poland, he came to the United States, accepting a faculty position at the University of Iowa College of Medicine. For 40 years, his colleagues and students knew him as a brilliant surgeon. They did not know he was a gulag survivor. His silence was deliberate. Bardach returned to a world exhausted by atrocity. The Soviet Union, once an ally, was now a Cold War adversary, yet the mechanics of its gulag system remained unknown in the West. Even after Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago in 1973, the specific brutality of Kolyma, the deadliest camp, remained abstract. Bardach's story was filled with incomprehensible details: calculated starvation, lethal winters, and an impossible escape. The audacity made it hard to share. Who would believe a starving prisoner, jaw wired shut, had stolen a dynamite truck and driven past guards? The truth sounded fictional. Moreover, Bardach was never a recognized POW. The Soviets deemed his imprisonment criminal punishment, his escape theft of state property. Unlike Allied POWs with official status, Bardach was a Polish Jew arrested by Soviets, a victim with no military record. His survival was personal, not tactical, and in the Cold War, his individual story was overwhelmed by the larger narrative of communist repression. Yet the story survived in fragments. Fellow Kolyma survivors remembered his medical work, and his Moscow mentor kept the memory alive. Bardak's own family knew he had been imprisoned, though he shared few details. His wife understood that certain nightmares recurred without explanation, and certain questions went unanswered. In Iowa, he occasionally met other Eastern European immigrants who had survived Soviet camps, recognizing a shared knowledge that needed no words. At the University of Iowa Hospital, Dr. Bardak taught facial reconstruction with an obsessive precision. He stressed the psychological importance of restoring appearance, not just function, to give patients back the face they remembered. His students assumed this philosophy came from medical humanism, not from the personal experience of having one's face destroyed and rebuilt from understanding that dignity lives or dies with the face. The explosives truck story, with its audacious improbability, remained entirely private. The rediscovery began in the 1990 seconds with the Soviet Union's collapse and the opening of Gulag archives. Interest grew. A graduate student learned of Professor Bardak's imprisonment in 1995 and requested an interview, which Bardak declined. But when a documentary filmmaker located him in 1996, Bardak agreed to speak. In 3 hours of testimony, he described Kolyma in detail: the starvation, the lethal gold mines, the punishment cells, the interrogation that broke his jaw. Then, almost as an aside, he mentioned escaping by stealing a truck. The filmmaker stopped the camera, asking him to repeat the story. Bardak explained the sequence: the opportunity, the drive through the gates, the weeks in the wilderness, his recapture, and the miraculous intervention of Dr. Katz. Realizing this was an extraordinary account, the filmmaker urged him to write it down. The advice landed at the right time. Bardak was in his 70s, and fellow Kolyma survivors were dying, their memories of the camp's brutal mechanisms disappearing with them. With a wave of Russian revisionist history claiming the Gulag was exaggerated, Bardak understood his testimony carried a weight that archives alone could not. He began writing Man is Wolf to Man, Surviving the Gulag, co-authored with Kathleen Gleason, was published in 1998 by the University of California Press. Its title, From Pliny the Elder's Ancient Observation on Human Cruelty, was a fitting descriptor for the world Bardak survived. The book gained significant attention in academic and human rights circles, offering specificity over sensationalism. Bardak didn't write abstractly about suffering. He detailed the temperature of his cell, the taste of rotten fish soup, and the sound of the truck's engine. Soviet historians immediately recognized its value. Kolyma was the deadliest Gulag camp, with mortality rates near 50%, yet few detailed survivor accounts existed. His medical training gave his account an analytical precision, detailing everything from systematic starvation to primitive medical conditions that filled gaps in the historical record. His escape became a case study in audacity. Successful escapes from the remote Kolyma were extraordinarily rare, as most who broke out died of exposure. Bardak's story stood out because he survived recapture, an almost unprecedented outcome. The modern military legacy of Bardak's story lies not in formal doctrine, but in its lessons on resistance. U.S. Military survival, evasion, resistance, and escape schools teach resisting by all means available, and Bardak's experience is a powerful illustration. He resisted by using his medical work to keep prisoners alive, by gathering intelligence that later helped historians, and through the escape itself, an act of improbable daring that served as a psychological victory despite his recapture. SARE instructors reference his escape to teach opportunity recognition. He saw a chance and took it immediately, accepting enormous risk over the certainty of a slower death. While the Pentagon's Defense POW MIA accounting agency has no file on Bardak, its researchers have read his memoir for insights into Soviet detention systems. His detailed descriptions of NKVD interrogation, psychological warfare, and the use of arbitrary punishment to break prisoner solidarity inform modern resistance training. His strategy of making himself useful through medical skills also parallels military training for captured personnel. The book reached other survivors. Bardoch received letters from former Gulag prisoners, silent for 50 years, who found a language for their trauma in his account. Several published their own testimonies, citing his memoir as the catalyst, a legacy of one witness enabling others. At the University of Iowa, his colleagues and former students finally learned the full story. The university hospital created an exhibit, and his book became part of the medical ethics curriculum, a primary example for navigating moral choices under totalitarian regimes. His decision to save lives within a system built to destroy them raises questions still relevant to physicians working under authoritarian power. This legacy extends to plastic surgery. His insistence on restoring a patient's appearance and focusing on the psychological dimension of facial trauma helped advance standard techniques. His Iowa colleagues finally understood his philosophy was forged by someone who knew from experience that the face is where identity and dignity reside. Dr. Janusz Bardach died in 2004 at 82. At a memorial service attended by hundreds, many heard the full Kolyma story for the first time. His family donated his papers, including memoir drafts, survivor correspondence, and a photo of his damaged jaw to the University of Iowa. His legacy is now formally recognized. His name is on the Gulag Museum's memorial wall in Moscow, marked as both survivor and witness. The University of Iowa established the Janusz Bardach Lecture Series in medical ethics, and in Poland, his story is taught to school children and featured in museum exhibitions about resistance and survival, with one displaying a photo of a similar explosives truck to explain his escape. Today, as authoritarianism resurges, Bardach's story matters beyond historical documentation. His testimony is a blueprint for how systems of dehumanization operate and how individuals resist. The Gulag was designed to erase people. Bardach refused erasure, surviving through intelligence, skill, luck, and mortal risk. His escape failed in the immediate sense, but succeeded in a larger one. It proved that agency existed, that the system could be defied. He left a dual legacy of restoration. In surgery, he restored what violence took from individuals. In testimony, he restored what totalitarianism tried to erase from history. His surgical work ended with his death, but his witness work continues. His memoir remains in print. Its most improbable detail, the explosives truck escape, verified by post-1991 Soviet archives. A file from 1943 records a prisoner escape via stolen vehicle, the recapture, and the unusual decision to retain the prisoner for medical work. This impersonal notation validates the story Bardach remembered with terror and heat. He chose to write late in life, understanding that private memory dies while recorded testimony persists. The man whose jaw was broken by Soviet power found his voice in the written word. His message about brutality, resistance, and dignity continues to matter because the conditions that created Kolyma have not disappeared. They have only changed locations and names. Dr. Bardach left Iowa City a memorial and a warning. The memorial is in the faces he repaired. The warning is in his memoir. Both declare that what was done by humans to humans can be done again unless the testimony survives, unless witnesses speak, unless we understand that the choice between dignity and degradation exists even in hell. He made that choice daily in Kolyma and again when he wrote the book. His legacy is not inspiration, it is instruction.